Remember when graphics cards came in boxes like this? Wasn't that fun? Having only really started getting into PC gaming around 2009, I gotta ask, was it commonplace for free download codes of games to come bundled with graphics cards? Well, okay, I guess that's still a thing they do today, but for me, I'll always remember a time a graphics card I bought gave me a free download code for 2 games. Those 2 games being the SiN series. Developed by Dallas-based studio Ritual Entertainment, SiN is a series of first-person shooters on the PC, premiering during a time when the popularity of first-person shooters on the PC was arguably at its peak, with games like Doom, Quake, and Duke Nukem 3D utterly dominating the PC gaming scene in the mid-90s. Hell, by this time, the popularity of the FPS would start to trickle into consoles with games like GoldenEye. But as you'll soon see, being at the right place at the right time doesn't always guarantee success. In fact, a game being a victim of poor timing can spell doom for most projects, leaving them to get lost in obscurity for years, if not just altogether. SiN had a bumpy ride during its initial release, but Ritual Entertainment fought like hell to keep the series afloat. SiN would eventually go on to get an expansion pack, a 90-minute anime sequel film, and its only game sequel was its first entry in what would have been an episodic experience. We've got a lot of ground to cover here, so join me as I pay my respects to the SiN series in the franchise graveyard. SiN's development team consisted of 15 members, many of whom had previously worked at 3D Realms on Duke Nukem 3D, including one of its head level designers, Richard Gray, also affectionately known as the Level Lord. Beginning development in 1997, Ritual, then known as Hypnotic Interactive, took the popular Quake engine and began work on their first major release as a company. SiN was initially planned for a spring 1998 release if this magazine preview is anything to go by, but partway through development, Quake developer id Software would release Quake 2, which ran on the then-new Quake 2 engine. Presumably not to have the game run on an outdated engine, the decision was made within Ritual to switch to this new engine. If the game really was intended for a spring 98 release, it sure wasn't going to make that deadline now. If you're unfamiliar with SiN, you're probably wondering what the game is even about, so let's break down the plot. SiN takes place in the year 2037 in the fictional metropolis of Freeport. In this theoretical future, the police have effectively lost the war on crime, and it's gotten so bad to the point where the country's biggest corporations have been given the right to form their own private security forces. One of the most successful of these private security forces is known as Hardcore, led by Colonel John R. Blade. Yes, that's really his name. Of course, the game doesn't actually tell you any of that, because as soon as you start a new game, you begin with a mission of breaking up a bank heist. The game's plot mainly focuses on the missions at hand rather than explaining character backstories. So you won't hear about your comrade JC's backstory of him being a hacker who hacked into Hardcore security data and Blade hiring him instead of arresting him. Nor will you hear about the main villain's dad going missing. But I'm getting a little off track here. But what the game does tell you is that Blade has been on the hunt trying to find the source of a highly addictive street drug that's been plaguing the streets of Freeport, called U4. Despite it being in the streets for a while, it has recently started to transform its addicts into grotesque hulking mutants. After the end of the game's first handful of stages, it's revealed that U4, in its new concentrated version, is manufactured by none other than multi-million-dollar biotech company SiNTech, which is headed by the ultra-intelligent and ultra-sexy Alexis Sinclair. And yeah, I guess I should address the major elephant in the room. And yeah, I'm not gonna mince words here. Alexis Sinclair is sexy as all hell. Not only does she have undeniable sex appeal, she isn't above using her sexuality as a weapon, or at the very least a diversionary tactic. She's even shown at one point rewarding one of her subordinates with the promise of sex.
I'm extremely pleased by your devotion to the cause. You may join me in my chambers at 11:30 this evening. Don't be late.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, the in-game visuals may have aged considerably, but the point still gets across. and she's just made even more sexy in the game's sequel, but we'll get to that. You're probably wondering, why did they even bother making her so sexy in the first place? Well, let me tell you, there was no one in the world in the 90s more horny than the people who made computer games. Now, I'm sure this opens a whole can of worms about the over-sexualization of the game's only named female character, and the fact that said character happens to be the villain, but needless to say, you couldn't even dream of getting away with that today. This was around the time Lara Croft was making gaming headlines, and Ritual sought to take that to 11 with Alexis Sinclair. I'll be shocked if the upcoming 2021 remaster of this game doesn't censor or tone down Alexis in some way. I have a feeling that games journalists are going to have a field day with her. Alright, I think I've gone on long enough about that. Let's start talking about the actual gameplay. Whatever mission you're on will unfold over the course of several stages. Each stage contains many main objectives you'll have to complete in order to advance, with a few optional side objectives sprinkled in. Your main objective usually requires you to fulfill certain objectives in order to advance to the next area, and that more often than not requires you to find key cards to open doors. Yeah, we may be running on an upgraded Quake engine, but the gameplay is still very much rooted in Doom tradition. Well, that may not sound super interesting, and one of the things I love to try to do with these videos is to sell you on whatever game I'm talking about. So what I can tell you is that the moment-to-moment gameplay is pretty fun. Remember that bank heist I brought up a while back? You start that mission with a brief turret section. Apparently that spells doom for most games when they have a turret section, but A, it doesn't last very long, and B, I find it sets the general tone of the game really well. Also, it introduces the concept of environmental damage affecting later levels in the game. Shooting down a SiN billboard will show it crashing through the bank roof, and in the next level, you'll be able to see it inside of the bank. On just a base level, though, just the act of running and gunning is a lot of fun as well. The genre-standard weapons are all here, including, but not limited to, the pistol, shotgun, submachine gun, rocket launcher, and even your own fists. Many of these weapons also have a secondary fire mode, which can be toggled on and off with a right-click. You're bound to find one or two favorites amongst the in-game arsenal. For me personally, I find this to be one of the most satisfying video game shotguns ever. I just love shotguns, man. Something this game brings to the table which I actually don't see implemented in games today is the ability to take armor off of fallen enemies. Next to your health meter are armor ratings for your head, torso, and legs. As you can probably surmise, having these numbers as high as you can get them means your armor can do a better job of soaking up enemy fire. While you can find armor pieces laying around and in lockers, you can also take them off of enemies that you kill. For example, if you need more armor for your legs, shooting an enemy anywhere other than the legs will allow you a better chance of picking up their leg armor and using it for yourself. Though when you do this, it adds a pretty substantial amount of armor to yours, so if you try and do this too many times, all you're gonna hear is...
Already got it. Already got it. Already got it. Nope, don't need it. Already got it.
You can also shoot your enemies' weapons out of their hands with a well-aimed shot, but the catch to this is that your enemies can also do this to you. For the most part, the game is set within Freeport City, and as such, you'll be seeing a lot of urban settings like the streets, sewers, a dam, and a chem lab, to name a few. It starts pretty tame, but as you continue and as more of the mystery unravels, the environments you travel to will start to look more nightmarish. Exploring these areas is usually a lot of fun to do, but there are going to be times when the game asks you to do some platform jumping, and I gotta be honest with you, I've never been the biggest fan of the world of platforming in a first-person shooter with mouse and keyboard controls. I had a little bit of a hard time making precise landings, sometimes on very thin walkways, but luckily the game does have a quick save and quick load function in case you do mess up, and you're going to be using it a lot. The types of enemies you face off against, like the levels themselves, will also start to look weirder and more grotesque the more you go into the game. While you do square off with a mutant as the game's first real boss encounter, the game sort of holds off on showing you too many more mutants until about the game's halfway point. So until then, you're going to be going up against the usual goons with guns. I find the game does a pretty good job of finding the right places to introduce the enemy types. It does give you an early glimpse of mutants to hook you up, then finds just the right time to really start letting you see more of them. The tail end of the game throws snipers at you, and they can be pretty annoying if you don't take them out fast, as they can take you out in just 2 or 3 shots. Running and gunning isn't the only thing you're going to be doing, however. If the game calls for you to shut down security systems, hack terminals, or open certain gates from a control panel, it switches to this, I don't know, DOS-like computer screen. And some of these allow you to use your keyboard to physically type in commands. I don't know how commonplace this was in PC games in the 90s, but I found this to be pretty cool. There aren't too many vehicle segments in this game, aside from a quick ride on a bulldozer to break down a wall or two. But there is an ATV towards the end of the game while you're outrunning rising magma, and let me tell you, if you were to tell me this ATV was a last-second addition, I'd totally believe you. It controls incredibly slippery, and I had a bad habit of driving off the edge of the level. Thankfully, it's over pretty quickly. Since we're being critical now, I might as well address that the game does have a few annoying, though ultimately harmless, glitches. Opening doors, lockers, and cabinets has a habit of either closing right away or, and this is weird, doing crush damage to me, depending on where I was standing. You kind of have to be standing a certain way for the door to open all the way and not hurt you, and that's pretty annoying, I'm not gonna lie. NPCs also have a pretty annoying tendency to run and cower directly into doorways you need to go through if they hear gunfire. I had one do it right in front of a door I needed to go through, and the only way I could get through it was to kill the harmless NPC and get yelled at by JC for it.
Wait, what are you doing, man? Those are friendlies.
The only other major complaint I had with this game is that there's a couple of underwater areas towards the end of the game that I found to be very slow and just a bit too long. I honestly found these to be the low point of the game. I never look forward to revisiting them. SiN will take you somewhere in the ballpark of 7 to 9 hours to finish, depending on your difficulty level, and if you actively seek out the optional areas. I can easily recommend SiN if you're looking for an old-school shooter from the late 90s. Aside from some annoying glitches and those underwater levels that are as slow as frozen molasses, SiN's very much worth checking out if you loved games like Quake. I mean, hell, I've never played Quake, and I still enjoyed SiN. I've personally racked up over 30 hours between 3 save files, so that should tell you how much I enjoyed it. SiN would go on to sell quite well for its first week. Then its sales numbers took a sharp nosedive. There were a few reasons for this. In its initial release, SiN was plagued with some pretty gnarly bugs during a time when releasing patches wasn't as quick and painless as it is today. The game also had some painfully long load times, which have since been vastly improved, but reviews were quick to point out all of these flaws. But probably the biggest obstacle the game had in achieving amazing sales was its timing. SiN was released on November 9th, 1998, and just 10 days later, another game would come along and effectively revolutionize PC gaming, and therefore eclipse SiN. And that game was the original Half-Life. Despite these patches of bad luck, SiN still sold well enough to justify releasing an expansion pack. Released roughly 4 months after the main game, SiN's lone expansion pack, Wages of SiN, would be released, this time developed by 2015 Games rather than Ritual. SiN alongside Wages of SiN would eventually be released together as SiN Gold, which is the version you can now get on Steam and GOG.com. In fact, I would have actually made this video a year earlier, but I didn't have access to the DLC until 2020 when new series publisher Night Dive Studios released SiN Gold as a free update to the original Steam release. So I effectively got the DLC for free. Publishers have been giving free updates to owners of the original Steam releases for games a lot lately, and I freaking love it. Wages of SiN takes place nearly a month after the events of the main game. A mob boss named Monero makes his move to take over Freeport City with his own army of mutants. Catching the eye of our favorite wisecracking hardcore officer, Blade seeks to hunt down Monero and put an end to his grasp for power. Right away, you'll notice that Wages of SiN takes on a much more cinematic approach to its storytelling, with dynamic camera movements and more liberal use of cutscenes. The opening cutscene itself is roughly 7 minutes long. Wages of SiN gives you many of the same weapons from the main game, but also tosses in a few new ones, such as a crossbow, guided missiles, which are a lot of fun to use, and now you can even dual-wield pistols, and you're going to need them to fend off the new types of mutants which look quite freakier than the ones in the main game. The game also introduces new mechanics such as rope climbing, rope swinging, and you even get a flashlight in this game, thank God, because the original game had a tendency to make some areas obnoxiously dark. Yeah, that's not something I brought up in this segment on the original, but yeah, I had the brightness cranked all the way up and it was still a struggle to see sometimes. And now, for the sake of transparency, what I recorded here was my first ever playthrough of the expansion pack, so I had a bit of a habit of getting lost in some of the game's larger areas. The warehouse and the cargo ship in particular are two enormous areas, both of which require a fair amount of backtracking. And the cargo ship is so big that it had to be segmented off by the same kind of loading screens that you would normally see when leaving one level and entering another. And the warehouse I mentioned, which requires a lot of backtracking, has a lot of turrets that open fire on you if you get too close to a door, if you don't shut them off from a terminal first. It took me a good hour to navigate my way through this area, and by the end of it, I didn't even shut down the last turret. I just brute forced my way through it until I triggered the end of the level. I will say that the game's plot tries to do something pretty interesting with introducing a sort of cult of mutants, but then it just sort of forgets about it. Blade's mission is putting a stop to Monero, and it does end with a pretty fun boss fight. But overall, Wages of SiN isn't something I see myself revisiting nearly as often as the main game, or even the game that comes after. I kind of dread revisiting those two big confusing levels. So hey, did you know SiN had a movie? Because it did. I guess SiN ended up gaining some kind of cult following after its release because it got an hour-long anime film loosely based off of it. As you probably already know, I like to include any kind of development history I can find on whatever I feature in these videos, but for the life of me, I can't find anything that led to this movie getting made. I just know that it exists, and as such, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about it. Released in October 2000, SiN the movie isn't so much a sequel to the game, but more so an alternate continuity. For starters, the movie is set in the 2070s rather than the year 2037, but the characters don't look that much older. I mean, JC looks a bit older, but not 30 years older. And none of the events of the game are mentioned at all. Speaking of which, they kill off JC within the first few minutes. The movie just straight up opens with his funeral. So what, did people find JC to be too annoying in the game? Is that why they did this? I don't know, I thought he was alright. I don't really understand why they killed him off, only to replace him with his sister, who also just so happens to be named JC. I don't know. I'm gonna wrap this up because I don't feel very comfortable having footage from the movie on screen for too long, but overall, SiN the movie is okay. It's a decent enough early 2000s cyberpunk anime that makes for a decent watch if you've got an hour to kill, but it doesn't really look or feel like SiN. And that's a shame. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up this little forgotten piece of Ritual's history. 3 years prior to the release of the sequel we would eventually get, known as SiN Episodes Emergence, Ritual put together a prototype demo for a potential direct sequel to the '98 original to pitch around to publishers. This sequel would have ran on id Tech 4, the same engine behind Doom 3, Prey, and Quake 4, among others. Sadly, this version would be scrapped as Ritual were unable to find a publisher, and the project would have been too costly to self-publish. If you find yourself interested in seeing what could have been, 3D Realms recently released the never-before-seen prototype trailer on their YouTube channel, link in the description. So with SiN 2 simply not being in the cards for Ritual, they went back to the drawing board to decide how best to make their next game. Around this time, Valve had announced that the big expansion of the groundbreaking Half-Life 2 would be released episodically, and Ritual believed that they could self-publish the game and keep the cost to make it on the lower end if they took a similar approach, with each episode effectively paying for development of the next. Or at least, that was the idea. The plan was to release each of the planned 9 episodes for $20 each every 6 months or so, have them be roughly 4 to 6 hours long, and even ask for player feedback on what to include in upcoming episodes as they were being developed. I'll be honest with you, in 2006 when this game came out, I was firmly exclusively into console gaming, so I didn't even know SiN Episodes was actually supposed to be a sequel to something. Which I guess wouldn't have been a big deal because A, the original game came bundled for free, and B, hardly any of the original game is referenced anyway. I'm skipping around a bit, but of the planned 9 episodes, only the first one was released, an episode called Emergence. SiN Emergence takes place roughly 4 years after the events of the first game. And when you first start a new game, the very first thing you're greeted with is...
Tell me, how do you expect this to end?
Anyway, after a brief taunting by the returning Alexis Sinclair and new villain Roddick, Blade is rescued almost immediately by his newest companion, Jessica Cannon, voiced by Jen Taylor.
Damn, Blade, how long are you just gonna wait around? Don't worry, you're gonna be fine. We just need to... My god, what did they inject you with?
Yeah, this was after the first 2 Halo games, so at the time, Jen Taylor was like the female Troy Baker. She was in everything.
Now, what is your destination?
South corner of fuck and you.
Anyway, you soon find out that Blade has been injected with something, but before you can figure out what it is, Alexis's Syntech goons start firing on you, and you have to escape. Where the first game opens with a turret section followed by a standard run-and-gun level, Emergence takes the opposite approach and doesn't have you fire a gun until a good 20 minutes in. So you know how I said the first game was overshadowed by Half-Life? Well, Ritual must have been really heavily inspired by Half-Life 2 when they made this, because not only does it run on the Source engine, it takes quite a few cues from Half-Life 2 as well. A chatty female companion who does all the talking for you, to the city, or part of it anyway, being overrun with an antagonistic security force. Even Blade, who would constantly crack wise, is left almost completely mute this time around. The only time Blade speaks anymore is when you answer the optional communications link calls.
Talk to me, Jessica.
What is the Promexia Project?
It just feels so bizarre for the game to have Blade, who always had something to say, be left silent during big moments. It's hard to tell with this first episode, but I would like to think they would have given Blade more to say had the game gone past 1 episode. On the plus side, he is voiced by the same actor as the original game, as far as I can tell. Though the new engine does come with its own set of perks. For one thing, for 2006, this is a gorgeous looking game. I'd even submit that this game looks even prettier in some places than Half-Life 2, though it may not perform as well. I did encounter a bit of micro-stuttering here and there, but it's nothing too bad. As a result, Emergence feels like a faster-paced Half-Life 2. When you do get your hands on some guns, the shooting feels fast and frantic, not too dissimilar to the original. Enemies don't gib quite the same way like in the original, but it's still pretty gory in places. Emergence uses something called adaptive difficulty, meaning the better you play the game, the more challenging the game makes itself. Basically, it'll throw more enemies at you. I personally find it to be a neat idea, but one that kind of drags sections out a touch too long, to be honest. You only get 3 weapons this time around, a standard pistol, a shotgun, and an assault rifle, but I imagine had the game gone past 1 episode, you would have gotten your hands on more. They're all fun to use, especially the shotgun. I honestly forgot how fun this one is to use. You also get a melee attack with the guns, but I never really used it all that much because of the default key binding. There's also an option to aim down sights now, but again, due to its default key binding, I never really used it. But considering how accurate I was making headshots with the pistol, I found I didn't really need it. Emergence only lasts around 2.5 hours, but they do manage to set up quite a bit in its short runtime. Halfway through, you run into the series' trademark mutants, and you even fight one as a boss fight a couple of times. Granted, it's the same type of mutant twice, but it's a pretty fun fight against a monster that can sling you around easily. A new gameplay element that the game implements is being exposed to mutagen. A meter builds every time you stand in front of this green gas, and doing so essentially gives you bullet time for a short time. But you don't want to let the meter build all the way, or else you'll start taking continuous damage. You only run into these a few times in the back half of the game, but I imagine they would have done something really creative with it had the game gone past 1 episode. Yeah, I'm saying that a lot in this video, aren't I? Well, what can I say? This game is actually only 1/9 of a full game, and it ends on a major unresolved cliffhanger. I couldn't find anything on what they wanted to implement for future episodes, and it doesn't look like anyone from Ritual said anything about what they wanted to include. It's like the series' whole existence just ended after Emergence shipped. If you just take it by itself, though, sure, Emergence is a ton of fun, and I respect this game forever for being the game that introduced me to Alexis's convention model, Bianca Beauchamp? Well, she's French-Canadian, so maybe it's pronounced Beauchamp.
Are you going to finish that croissant?
Oui, oui, baguette.
Whether or not you want to pay $10 for a 2-hour shooter, I'm gonna leave up to you, but I do recommend checking out Emergence, both as a fun shooter and as a look at what could have been. Probably worth mentioning is that Emergence was released less than a month before Half-Life 2 Episode 1, which may or may not have affected Emergence's sales. I can't be sure, though, that's just a theory on my part. In an interview with Ritual's Community Hub, Ritual co-founder Richard Gray stated that while Emergence had sold well enough to recoup development costs, it didn't sell well enough to justify self-publishing a second episode. While development did begin, they ran into monetary issues before the company was acquired by a casual games company called Mumbo Jumbo in early 2007. After they were acquired, Ritual as a company would be dissolved, effectively killing the SiN series and any hope of an episode 2. And for over a decade, the SiN series was just sort of forgotten by all but a few dedicated fans. That was until 2020, when Night Dive Studios, a studio made famous for their modernized re-releases of classic abandonware such as Forsaken, System Shock, and Turok, announced that they had acquired the rights to the SiN series and re-released SiN Gold on Steam in March of that year. But they didn't stop there. They also announced that a full remaster of the original game, which is being co-developed by 3D Realms and Slipgate Ironworks, would be coming in 2021. Hell, judging by how long this damn video is taking to come out, it might already be out by the time this video gets finished. This is an excellent sign of life for fans of the series. Hell, who knows what could come from this if the remastered SiN Reloaded sells well enough. Have them do the Crash Bandicoot 4 thing and have a new developer make a new sequel to the original game? Well, it could happen if SiN Reloaded sells well enough. I guess for now we'll just have to wait and see. It's always nice when a trip down the franchise graveyard ends on a hopeful note for a change.